Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from C4 MacDonald, who asked, "Hey Thor, love your content and I'm a proud Patreon supporter. This past week I finished watching both Ahsoka and finally got around to finishing Season 3 of Star Trek Picard. After watching both of them, I couldn't help but notice the similarities between them and how Picard was able to nail the story better than Ahsoka did. Star Trek Picard is a sequel series to The Next Generation that is focused mainly on one character. They are very unapologetic about it being about that, and if you're not somebody who watched The Next Generation, you might be a little confused. This was for longtime fans. I felt like Ahsoka was just trying way too hard to both be a sequel series to Rebels, while also being something that the average fan who hasn't seen that before could enjoy, which caused it to not really fully satisfy either group. I did enjoy it, but felt it could be so much better. I think it's great to have shows like The Mandalorian that are very much so for everyone, but I think having shows that are mainly geared towards really deep fans who are rewarded for watching past shows is great as well. Would love to hear what you think about this, and thank you for all the interesting discussions you bring to the table." And yeah, I do tend to agree that the Ahsoka series didn't feel like it knew exactly what it wanted to be or what its target audience was supposed to be. It felt both like something that was supposed to be for anybody and everybody to just kind of watch and enjoy, as well as a sequel to Rebels that, in this strange sort of way, didn't want to give the impression or go all in on the fact that it was supposed to be a sequel to that show. Meaning that if it truly wanted to be, or mainly be, a sequel to that series, or a Season 5 of Rebels for all intents and purposes, there were more things it could have and should have done to achieve that, or to make it even more satisfying for fans of that show. Again, it didn't seem like it wanted to go all in on it, and likely because it didn't want to make it feel inaccessible to the more casual fan. And don't get me wrong, you do want the show to have wide appeal, right? You don't want to make it something that's so for the fans that a non-fan is just utterly lost and confused at all times, because even the basic story itself is so intertwined with the lore or past events, they couldn't even hope to ever figure out what's going on. Which then brings us to something like Picard Season 3, that it made no secret, hell, it seems very proud of the fact that this is for the fans, and that if you hadn't seen Star Trek The Next Generation, and virtually every other piece of Star Wars content ever, because there were callbacks and Easter eggs to everything, but if you hadn't seen Next Generation in particular, it was like, yeah, you're going to not get everything out of this. You are going to miss things. But even though you were missing out on stuff, and likely you felt like you were if you were a non-fan, for you there was still a pretty solid story at the core of it all about a father realizing he has a son and learning how to handle that, and how the son handles that as well, while also running into and reuniting with the father's old crew, who also may have some personal conflicts to resolve, as well as plenty of good action and a story about a threat to the Federation, which didn't exactly require too much to understand or to follow along with. And so, if Picard Season 3 was the first Star Trek thing you'd ever seen, yeah, there were no doubt plenty of things you were going to miss and be confused by. But the characters, the way they were handled, was very well done. More than enough to probably get you to still be able to enjoy the story itself. And perhaps even enough to make you curious to check out more stories with these characters, to go back and actually watch Star Trek The Next Generation, or just Star Trek in general. And I'm really not so sure the Ahsoka series did anything quite like that for casual fans. I don't know that anybody watched Ahsoka and was like, well, now I need to fire up Rebels. I'm not so sure it sold these characters to those unfamiliar with them, or should I say, made them care about these characters. And even those who were familiar with them going in, who had seen Rebels, who love Rebels, or just had a vast general knowledge of Star Wars, enough so to know these characters and their basic stories, most of us were left sort of to infer how these characters were supposed to be feeling and why, with many saying that they felt like these weren't even the same characters from Rebels anymore, that something was off about them. And though the show does sort of try to explain this change in the characters by manufacturing this kind of failed master and apprentice relationship between Sabine and Ahsoka off screen, between two characters that, off the top of my head, I don't recall even once talking to each other in Rebels, though I'm sure they probably did. And yes, I also realize Rebels, the epilogue, implies they would have talked to each other and gone off together to form some sort of relationship. But beyond this new master and apprentice relationship that again happens off screen, the show doesn't really ever try to do much to show or really help you understand where these characters even came from, or how they're connected to each other, and how important that connection really is. I mean, the backbone of the show Rebels is that they are all like a family. Yet here, again, unless you already knew and had seen the show, you don't know why or how, say, Hera and Sabine even know each other. Or why Sabine is so obsessed with finding Ezra, why she'd risk the fate of the entire galaxy on finding him, other than a recording left by Ezra where he refers to Sabine as like a sister to him. For example, one of the questions I get asked most from the few people I personally know who watch this, that being friends and family who are more on the casual side of the fandom, let's say, what they tend to ask the most about the Ahsoka series is simply, who are these characters? And it's not that they didn't get any enjoyment out of the show at all. Most seem to kind of like it, actually, from what they've said, though not as much as they enjoyed Mando. It's more that they just don't fully or even begin to understand where they all even came from and how they fit together. They don't know why they should care. I mean, pretty much the most popular question I got asked was, how did this Thrawn guy and Ezra even get to this other galaxy in the first place? And then I tell them, well, the Purrgil, or the Star Whales, I guess we call them now, they took them there 10 years ago in story, which gets followed up by, well, why did they do that? Why did the Star Whales take them there? And then another explanation from me comes about how Ezra was shown to have a connection to these creatures in Rebels, which isn't even remotely touched on or hinted at in the show, and that they just took them there during this big battle at a planet called Lothal, which was Ezra's homeworld, which then of course leads to even more questions. Basically, those who don't know Rebels had to go down this rabbit hole of questions to begin to figure out who the characters in the show even were and why they were in these positions, instead of the show ever really doing much of anything to try and help them understand. Which isn't to say it had to answer every single question about them, but it didn't need to make you feel something for them. A reason to care is all you kind of need to get vested in a character. You don't need their entire life story to begin to care about them. You need something to latch onto, and I really don't know that the show ever gave people a reason to care or latch onto any of these characters. This show really felt like an attempt by Dave Filoni to kind of replicate George Lucas' Star Wars, where you get thrown right into the middle of the story, right into the action, and the details or fully understanding everything isn't really the most important thing ever. You're just supposed to go along with the flow, you're supposed to go with the characters, or go along for the ride, because the characters themselves are interesting enough to keep you on the ride, if you will. And that worked with the original Star Wars film that we now call A New Hope, because people liked Han, Luke, and Leia, and hence they were more than happy to, again, go along for the ride, even if they didn't fully understand everything going on around them. But if you neither like nor understand the characters, if the ride itself with them isn't entertaining, you start to ask a bunch of questions, feeling like you must be missing something. There must be some detail you didn't notice that was meant to make you care about what's going on or about the characters in general, other than maybe the show flat out telling you should care, like I've pointed out many times before it did with Thrawn. Another thing that many seemed confused by was the whole Anakin-Ahsoka thing in Episode 5. They didn't understand what that was all about or what was even actually happening. And if you're someone who didn't see the Clone Wars, but at least knows what it is, which isn't the case for everyone, but if you at least know what the Clone Wars was about in general, what the show was about in general, who Ahsoka was and her relationship with Anakin to some degree, you're probably going to assume you just missed something key from that show, something that would make that whole scene or sequence with Anakin and Ahsoka in the world between worlds make more sense. But that isn't exactly the case. Even us fans of the Clone Wars, those who love it and have seen it multiple times, we don't fully understand or agree upon what the lesson Ahsoka was meant to learn even was. In fact, and this even goes back to what I was kind of talking about before and even talking about a bit in yesterday's video, plenty of fans are kind of doing the legwork for Filoni after I have admitted in a couple videos that I don't fully understand what the lesson was supposed to be. I've gotten comments, and probably will again in this video, from people who are like, well, obviously this is what Dave was trying to convey here, how could you miss it? And I'm sorry, but no, it wasn't obvious. If it was obvious, there wouldn't be any debate or discussion around it. Not much of one anyway. Sure, we would not all completely agree, but I've seen so many different, widely varying different takes on what that lesson was supposed to be that it is impossible to say it was obvious. But anyway, letting that go and to wrap this up, yeah, I think the show sort of suffered from not fully embracing the idea that this was going to be Rebels Season 5, which in turn was part of the reason I think Picard Season 3 was a success. It embraced being a sort of final chapter of Star Trek The Next Generation, and it embraced it with wide open arms. while also still managing to be something that I think, and mind you, I'm a fairly big Star Trek fan, but not what you might consider a Trekkie. But from my more casual fan position, I thought Picard Season 3 was fantastic, and I loved what it tried to be and what it was. And I think, going back to the question now, in general, it makes more sense to lean into what the fans want, to reward them, as you said, more so than make things sort of generic that, as some have said, the characters then sort of are unrecognizable, or that so much has happened since we last saw them that we feel like we missed a huge important chunk of the story. And the thing is, if you do a show really well and have it more geared towards the fans and somewhat, though not entirely reliant on previous content or previous parts of the story from elsewhere, you may just lure people in to watch that previous content, which should really be kind of the point of something like Disney Plus, right? It should kind of be their goal to keep people subscribed and watching all the previous content as well. So shouldn't these new shows make people ask questions and then go back to watch the, again, previous content? But not so many questions or be so confused that they have no clue what's going on in the moment, which, at least from the feedback I got from others, which is only a handful of people, this isn't like proof of anything, but the little bit of feedback I got said that people were really confused, and not in the intrigued sort of way, but just in the confused sort of way. They found it more frustrating not understanding what was going on, rather than making them curious enough to, well, go fire up the first episode of Rebels. Well, that's enough for this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about this one. Was Ahsoka too much of a mix between for the fans and for the general audience, and was that a flaw? Or was there something else that kind of went wrong? Or maybe you think everything was a-okay with the show and you loved it as is. Or of course you can always ask a question for a future lightning response video. And I really have been meaning to do a video that, as I was saying a few days ago, tries to kind of answer a bunch of questions all in one video, a sort of rapid fire or rapid response video. But anyway, do leave those comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.